Federal Reserve is under new management. Well, not entirely, but that is the direction it is heading, with Stephen Moran being the newly appointed Fed governor at the Fed by Trump in order to try and get interest rates lower. We also know that Powell is on his way out, and at the most recent FOMC meeting, Moran was the only one who dissented from the opinion, saying that they should be cutting by 0.5% instead of just 0.25%. But in a move that we really don't see all that often, Moran actually published his opinions and his rationale for why he believes interest rates should be lowered by a lot compared to where they are now. And in a world that is shrouded in darkness, even if we disagree with his opinions here, it's nice that he at least has published them for us to go through and look at and disagree with. So let's do that. If you want to find this yourself, you can go to the Federal Reserve's website and look at non-monetary forces and appropriate monetary policies by Governor Stephen Moran. He notes that his view of the appropriate monetary policy is different from the other FOMC members. He thinks that the current policy is very restrictive. In other words, he thinks that interest rates are too high. He probably also thinks that the Fed should be ending QT, maybe even starting up QE again. But here he explains why. One note about here, anytime you see the R with the asterisk star next to it, he's referring to the neutral rate. Now, this is where we have to take our first pause, because the neutral rate itself is something that exists in the minds of economists and not reality. It is this imaginary interest rate that the Fed can choose that is neither expansionary nor contractionary. It is neither easy nor tight. And not only has the Federal Reserve never had interest rates at a neutral rate before, it just doesn't exist. And here's why. Let's imagine we all still live in the day and age when money was gold and silver coins, actual physical metal coins that had to be circulated for transactions. No paper, no digital, no fiat, just coins. Let's say everybody in our local economy has done a very, very good job at saving. We've all been working really hard. We've all been storing up our money underneath our mattresses. We have not really been spending. Everybody's been doing a good job of saving. In this situation, at this point in time, the savings pool is large, but that also means there's very little money actually in circulation because people are spending as little as they possibly can. People aren't borrowing, they're not spending, they're not investing, they're just saving. And then one of us gets a bright idea and we look at our pile of money and we say, you know what? I would like to spend this because I would like to make an investment, build a little business, and actually put this money to work. But I need more than what I've saved up. And so I'm going to go see if I can borrow some money from somebody. So I knock on my neighbor's door and I say, hey, can I borrow some money from you? And he says, yes, I'll lend you money for 1 year at 10%. I'm like, I don't know, that sounds kind of high. So I knock on my next door neighbor and ask him, can I borrow some money from you? He says, yeah, I'll lend you money for 1 year at 8%. Well, I keep on knocking on more and more doors, and eventually I get an offer that I just can't refuse, 2.5%. For 10 years. I go back and I knock on everybody else's door and tell them, hey, this is the deal that I'm getting offered down there. Do you want to try and beat it? And nobody does, so 2.5% is where I stick. So I'm able to borrow at a really great rate. I'm able to build my business and I'm able to start making some money. But when everybody found out that I was able to borrow at 2.5%, that gave them a similar idea because 2.5% is pretty low to borrow money at. So they go to the same neighbor and they say, hey, I would like to borrow some money from you at 2.5%. And nobody else is going to borrow at 3.5% or 4.5% unless all of the 2.5% money is taken up. And so at least for now, the standard borrowing rate for 1 year to start a business is going to be 2.5%. Now, some people are going to have to pay a little bit higher because maybe they're not as trustworthy. And so the lender doesn't know if they're actually going to get their money back. And maybe some people have to pay higher because they're like, hey, this is going to take me 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years to pay you back instead of just 1 year. But their going rate right now is 2.5% for a year. So everybody borrows as much as they can, but ultimately what this ends up doing is draining the savings pool because everybody who had money that they were willing to lend ends up lending it out. And sooner or later, there's not that much money left for people to lend. Yes, all that money is still going around, it's being circulated, but people have built up debt now. So yes, they have some money, they've got income, but they also owe money. So I get to the end of my year and I realize I might need a little bit more time in order to pay my debt back. So I go back and I say, hey, can I borrow again for another 2.5% for a year? And he says, no, I'm tapped out. I can't lend you anything. I start knocking on doors and everybody says the same thing. They don't have any money to lend. The only person I can find to borrow money from is saying 10%. And that makes sense because in the first situation, the savings pool was large. All of the lenders were competing for borrowers. But now the savings pool has been drained. There's not a lot of savings. Now all the borrowers are competing for lenders. And now the incentive switches because everybody finds out, hey, I can get paid 10% on my money just to hold money and lend it out. I'm going to save as much as I can so that I can become a lender. And that natural incentive then builds back up the savings pool by disincentivizing borrowing and spending, re-incentivizing saving and lending. So you see, in a sound money economy, the savings pool will be large or drained, but as that happens, the incentive will push to the other side in order to rebuild the savings account or in order to spend it down if there's room, productive capacity for more production. What this story shows is a couple of things about interest rates. Number one, interest rates are just the cost of capital. It's the cost of acquiring more money right now. It's how much money you have to pay to get your hands on money right now. And just like any price, it is determined by supply and demand. When the supply of money is high, the price of money is low. When the demand for money is high, the price for money is high. It also shows that there are different interest rates for different people and different things. Whether you are borrowing for a long period of time or a short period of time, whether you are a trustworthy borrower or not, and that any interest rate is simultaneously restrictive and expansionary depending on the person and the situation. Now, obviously, we know the Federal Reserve does not control interest rates across the entire yield curve. The Federal Reserve is only trying to find the neutral rate for the shortest end of the curve, the overnight rate. But here's the thing, the Fed is never actually trying to find the neutral rate, because if they were, the closest you can possibly get to that is to not control interest rates, to let the free market dynamically figure out what that interest rate should be depending on the supply and demand of money in the system. And that would also work in a fiat world. In fact, the entire purpose of having monetary policy at all is to control interest rates so that they are not the natural rate. Because if the goal was to get to the natural rate, what it would be without intervention, then you would just let it happen without intervention. But interest rates are always either restrictive or expansionary, or both at the same time, depending on the situation. And so monetary policy is designed to make the economy do something other than what it would do without that control, without that artificial signal being sent about whether money is abundant or scarce. In other words, they're always constantly attempting to control the signal to make people either spend more or less than they would if the signal was being sent to them honestly. Okay, but that was a long bunny trail. Let's get back to what Stephen Moran is saying about why interest rates should be lower. Okay, his first argument, he starts off with rents and the inflation specifically with rent prices. Housing represents nearly 16% of PCE. It's more than double that in the CPI. And he says that because measured inflation incorporates rental inflation with a lag, it's remained elevated above market rents for several years and is catching up. But he says that catch up is now complete with new rent indices showing this inflation is well below all tenant inflation, around 1% annualized. He basically says that rents are slowing down or even falling as a result of immigration policy. He says net immigration was about 1 million people per year for about a decade up until 2020. And with net zero immigration going forward, that would imply 1 point lower rent inflation per year. Now, we're going to get into the immigration thing a little bit here because that's his next point. He says the US population has grown by around 1% annually in recent years, driven largely by illegal immigration. And already in the first half of 2025, roughly 1.5 million of these immigrants have left the country. He says, assuming some overcounting, it's plausible to me that 2 million illegal immigrants will have exited the country by year end. That will reduce annual population growth from 1% down to 0.4%. Now, these numbers might be accurate. within the last couple of days, we got this report from the Department of Homeland Security saying that over 2 million illegal aliens are out of the United States in less than the last 250 days. Approximately 400,000 of these were deportations, and about 1.6 million were voluntary self-deportations. Now, given that this is the most recent data, it is probably true. However, it seems like a big jump, and maybe I'm just missing or looking at the wrong data here. But so far, the Office of Homeland Security statistics shows that net repatriations, which is deportations or removals, are in the tens of thousands, well below where they've ever been for the last decade. So maybe that data is just not updated yet, but it comes from the same source. So I don't know, maybe it's just different data. Also, just 1 month ago, CNN reported that ICE has only deported 200,000 people since Trump returned to office, which is less than half of the number that the Department of Homeland Security reported just a couple of days ago. And CNN reported a total of 350,000 deportations, which includes, as far as I can tell, self-deportations. So again, it probably is true that the number is close to 2 million. I don't know another source of data to look at to fact check that, but it does seem like a big jump given the numbers that were coming out within the last couple of months. Either way, that's going to have a severe impact on rent prices because immigrants, by and large, are going to be renting. And so without that upward pressure in rents, and that means we're going to have disinflation or maybe deflation in rent prices. But population growth impacts things other than rent prices, obviously, with things like the labor market and overall consumer spending. Now, obviously, this is a broad rule, but people, on average, must produce more than they consume. And we know that that has always been true throughout history because we have more today than we used to have. Now, obviously, there is a minority of people who produce most of the stuff and a majority of people who consume most of the stuff. But on average, humanity must produce more than it consumes. Otherwise, it would consume everything that it has produced, which we haven't done, at least not yet. So overall, it is good to have more people because you then have, on net, more production. And the places that have a declining population are facing economic catastrophe. In the United States since about 1970, 1965, the only reason we've had a growing population is because of immigration. Now, obviously, there's good immigration, there's bad immigration. You want people who are going to be productive. You want people who want to be there. You don't want people who want to completely ruin the place. Essentially, you want as many good immigrants as possible and as few bad immigrants as possible. And everybody has different opinions about what good and bad mean there. But regardless, it is true that if we do enter into a situation soon where we actually do have a declining population all across the entire economy, that is not a good thing. That is a very negative thing. Moran then goes on to talk about increases in national savings from trade policy. And I would just like to point out this graph right here, this little blue bar, which shows $122 billion, is the cumulative tariff revenue from January through July of 2025. Obviously, the number is higher now because we're sitting in September. We're sitting at a little over $200 billion right now. But still, $200 billion is a far cry from the total federal budget deficit, which is sitting at $1.8 trillion. And that's not spending. That's just the deficit. That's the amount they have to borrow on top of the taxes for the rest of their spending. It is almost $1.9 trillion year to date. And the tariffs have brought in about $200 billion. So no, the tariffs are not going to make a meaningful difference on fiscal policy. And just to show you what this looks like compared to past years, this year up here with the black line is 2020. This is what we're looking at is the deficit tracker. So this is the number of dollars the government had to borrow in order to spend beyond its tax revenue. 2021 was 2.7 trillion. We had a big dip down in 2022 with $1.3 trillion deficit. The deficit then grew again in 2023 up to 1.69 trillion. And then 2024 grew again up to 1.8 trillion. And this purple line that you can see here all year long has been on track above 2024's monthly deficit numbers. We're already at $1.973 trillion. Now, you might be looking at this little dip where it was temporarily below 2024's numbers for June. And the only reason that happened was because of the way that the dates lined up for this year and when certain income was tracked versus not, which is why overall you can see that year to date, the deficit is still getting worse. But he also talks about tax legislation and how the lower tax rate is allowing the productive economy to keep more of the money that it has in order to put to work. And then he also talks about the effects of deregulation on energy. And he correctly points out that regulations can serve like an infinite tax rate that prohibits activity altogether, giving this example that a special snail being found in a region can restrict output much more than any finite tax. Points out that regulation hinders productivity growth, it restricts capacity, and ultimately helps fuel inflation. Points out that deregulation would raise the neutral rate of interest by increasing the marginal product of capital. Adding up everything that he's looked at here, he estimates that the neutral rate should be between 1% to 2%. That would put the Federal Reserve's current interest rates of around 4% far more restrictive than they should be. If the neutral rate is around 1% to 2%, then holding rates at around 4% will be causing damage to the labor market, will be causing potentially deflation. Oh no, who would want prices falling? Could tip us over into recession, could cause debt defaults and things like that. Now, some of the things that he pointed out in his paper are true, and I encourage you to go read it for yourself. Some of them are not true. However, this is a little bit of smoke and mirrors. This is not what it's all about. Let me show you what it's actually about. It's actually about $37 trillion of debt. It's actually about a debt to GDP ratio that is higher than we were at during the peak of World War II. It's actually about a 10-year treasury yield that is rising because the market believes the government is going to have to print its way out of this mess, devalue the currency in order to pay for all of their borrowing, which means that the market expects more inflation as the government borrows money into existence and uses that to pay their bills. The market expects no austerity, no spending cuts, no tough choices from this administration or any to come. Ever, which means the fastest way for the US government right now to decrease its costs is to get the Fed to lower the interest rate, because the vast majority of the federal government's debt is held in T-bills. Debt that gets rolled over every couple of months up to a year. And when the Federal Reserve lowers their interest rates, it has the most impact on these T-bill rates. Now, if they're able to get the rates on T-bills down by half and they're able to roll most of their debt over there, it might decrease the US government's interest costs by a couple $100 billion per year. It's a band-aid, not a solution. They really need to do something to get the 10-year yield lower, which again, they're going to need to rely on the Fed for. The Federal Reserve at some point is going to have to load up its balance sheet with US government debt that nobody else wants because the rates are too low. But the Fed doesn't care because they just print the money for their own expenses. So getting interest rates lower right now is step one, but it's not going to cut it for more than a couple of months. For that, we're going to need to see QE restart again and the Fed to start buying long government bonds. And if that doesn't happen, then maybe, just maybe, we can produce our way out of this mess, because at least if we ramp up production and produce a lot more goods and services and wealth in this country, then at least the US government can tax it away from us to pay for their own stupidity. As always, thank you so much for watching. Oh, and by the way, if you're not already signed up for my newsletter, it's free. I talk about stuff that I don't put out on YouTube. So if you'd like to see me in your inbox every single week, go ahead and click on the link below. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.